Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with long classics that I think are worth your time. And I feel like the length of a classic is largely what makes it intimidating to a lot of people. So I decided to do this recommendations video today, kind of in a series of other recommendations videos that I have been doing this year. Last year during Victober, I did several recommendations videos on a particular theme for Victorian literature specifically. I really enjoyed filming those videos, and it seems like a lot of y'all found them very helpful for recommendations. And so here in the new year, I really wanted to do those recommendations for just classics in general, not just specific to the Victorian time period. And so I will leave a link to my video that is all about long Victorian classics that I think are worth your time down below. I mentioned 5 of the big ones there, and so I'm not going to mention them here, and I don't think I'm really going to mention any other Victorian classic. These are also all going to be fiction recommendations because I recognize that classic nonfiction comes with its own set of parameters and also with its own set of intimidation factors, for me anyway. And so I just wanted this video to be all about fiction. These are all novels. Actually, I do have a set of plays here, weirdly enough, but I also did not include poetry. I feel like poetry is its own animal, especially epic poetry. So these are books where, to me, the length sticks out. And there are 2 kind of different types of length for me. One of them is just in general page count. The book is physically long. I think that's the majority of these recommendations. But there is a second category, which is where a book feels really long, where a book just really takes a lot out of you when you're reading it. And so that is my second category. Those books may not actually be that long in terms of page count, but in terms of just spending a lot of time in the book, they feel very, very long to me. So let's start with one that I think is tried and true, that is in fact probably my favorite of the list here. And it is a book that actually is one of the books that got me back into reading classics once I got out of school. And that may be kind of shocking to you based on just the length of this book. And that is The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo is, to this day, probably one of my favorite classics, if not my favorite classic novel that I've ever read. And I've discovered something about myself from being on BookTube, frankly, that I didn't know prior to getting on here. And it's just kind of the type of reader I am, the types of books that I'm attracted to. But being on the classic side of BookTube, though classics don't make up the majority of what I read, I do feel like it's a lot of what people subscribe to me for was classics content. And so I always get really interesting comments whenever I step out and I do read a classic, and especially when I don't like one. People will often say, how can you not like this when it was so literary, when it had so much to say? But for me, those books tend to have almost no plot. And occasionally, that's what I'm in the mood for. Occasionally, I'm in for something really slow, possibly some character work. And character is very important to me, but I think there's a reason why I don't read much literary fiction in the modern sense either. And so classics that skew literary for me are not really my favorites. They aren't the ones that I get on with. What I tend to really like when I rate a classic 5 stars, I notice that a lot of the time, it tends to be a classic that might be considered a little bit lower brow or a little bit more plot heavy. And The Count of Monte Cristo is certainly that. A lot of people look down on The Count of Monte Cristo if they are classics lovers, but a lot of people do tend to really love this. This is a perennial favorite for a lot of people. This is really the book that proved to me that I could read classics for fun. I'm not saying that people who read classics the majority of the time aren't reading them for fun, but a lot of times to me, they feel like they're giving you an education or like you're learning a lot. It feels a bit to me like they take more work out of you. And The Count of Monte Cristo required nothing of me except to have a good time. And that is why it was just absolutely fantastic. The Count of Monte Cristo is a revenge story. And I personally really love revenge stories, so I was really set up to like this. And it is one of the most masterful pieces of literature, in my opinion, because it justifies its length to you. Now, a lot of times, The Count of Monte Cristo will be sold abridged, Please don't do that. Do not rob yourself of the joy of this entire thing, because so much is added in there in terms of his revenge plan. This is something that is constructed over years, and it takes a long time to enact. And I personally think the ending is so much more rewarding if you have really spent that 1,000 or so pages with him. And one thing I really love about the Count of Monte Cristo is that he became so revenge fueled, and the narrative actually never made him apologize for that, which I found refreshing and I absolutely loved. For a book to have been written in the 19th century, I thought there was going to be a lot of meditation on guilt, on what you should do, on what you should be like, and forgiving the people who have wronged you. This book doesn't go there. And that makes it really interesting to me, not only as just a fun ride, a great read today, but it makes it interesting to me in a historical context. I love this. I love this. And the ending is absolutely spectacular in my opinion, and it is absolutely earned. Of everything on this list, this is the one that feels like it should have been the longest, and it is the one that justified its length to me. I never wished this was shorter, and even in times when I started to feel like it was dragging, when I got to the end, I felt like all of the time that I had spent with the characters and that I had spent in the world was justified. Really, it was, because I felt like everything added up very perfectly in the end for that solution. For me, this is a perfect book, and frankly, I would not do anything different. This one is absolutely worth your time. Let's talk about the Henry VI cycle by Shakespeare. I know that putting plays on here feels kind of odd because by default, they're really short. And Shakespeare in particular feels rather short. But I decided that I wanted to put the Henry VI cycle on here because they are parts 1, 2, and 3. It's a 3-part play. And I personally think it behooves you to read them all in one go. I think they work together very, very well. I know that goes against what some scholars will tell you, but I personally think you get a lot out of reading 1, 2, 3 back to back. But I will tell you, I have a controversial opinion by saying that I even like these because these are some of Shakespeare's lowest rated plays. So Henry VI, parts 1 through 3 are history plays, and they fit into the history cycle of Shakespeare. Now, I personally don't think you need to read all of the histories chronologically at all to get the most out of it, but I think you could do that, particularly if you aren't familiar with this time period in history. Now, I am very, very partial to these plays, but they rate very lowly for a lot of Shakespeare fans. I personally think they're stunning. I think the language is beautiful, and I really like the imagery and the symbolism and the foreshadowing that Shakespeare puts in here. A lot of what is set up in these plays doesn't pay off until Richard III, which is technically his last history play other than Henry VIII. And even more interestingly is maybe the background to these plays, because a couple of them, it's up for debate whether Shakespeare wrote them totally himself or if he wrote them with others. To me, these are really forgotten plays of his, but I personally think they're worth studying. I think they're worth reading. I personally got a lot out of reading these, both in a classroom setting and also for myself. And so these are some of my sentimental favorites of Shakespeare's, and I think it's really fun to read all 3 together. So this is one I would say is not necessarily long in terms of page count, but I think it can feel long to you because you really want to dig into this. And if you aren't familiar with the Wars of the Roses, I think you're going to want to be doing research on the side because this is most certainly not how history went. So I definitely recommend these, and I think they're worth your time. A Victorian classic that I did want to recommend is one that I did not mention in that earlier video that I did back at Victober. And this is a book that I'm sure most of y'all are sick of hearing me talk about, but there are some of you who are new to my channel, so you may not have heard me sing the praises of Varney the Vampire yet. But Varney the Vampire is an incredibly long penny dreadful from the Victorian era. If you don't know anything about penny dreadfuls, they were serialized fiction that was published across many years, and they were sold for a penny. And so a lot of the time, These are stories that really meandered. They didn't feel like they had a cohesive plot sometimes. Characterization is off because sometimes these got really popular and so they went on for longer than what you might think. And I personally think Varney must be one of those cases. Varney is one of the first examples of the vampire that we have in English fiction, aside from John Polidori's vampire. I think this is the next one up. And it is absolutely spectacular. This thing comes in at something like 1,800, 1,900 pages. And you can also get abridged versions of this. But I personally recommend the long one. I really thought this was fun. And I also, akin to The Count of Monte Cristo, never once wished this was shorter. I just was having a grand time. And I feel like this could go in conversation with The Count of Monte Cristo more broadly, just in terms of classics that I really like, classics that I tend to give 5 stars to, which are really plot heavy and fun, but that don't sacrifice character work. This to me was so fresh and new, it could have been written yesterday. It is just absolutely fantastic because Varney as a vampire character is also the first instance that we're getting of kind of the self-hating vampire. And I love it. The angst is absolutely incredible. And once you have read this, you see Varney's influence on basically everything in terms of vampire or even immortal fiction. Because I'm watching a show right now, I'm watching a K-drama called Island on Amazon Prime, which is fantastic if you're looking for a K-drama recommendation. Main character gives me such Varney vibes. I feel so sorry for him. And I feel this angst the way that I felt for Varney. Varney is like a weirdly sad book because the meditation on immortality and living too long and not getting what you want out of it, that was just really profound to me. And that's what I really am searching for in vampire stories. Please don't even call it a vampire story if you're not gonna deal with immortality, if you're not gonna deal with living a long time. But nearly every other character stood out to me as well. Frankly, I'm thinking about rereading this because I loved it so much. One of the characters betrayed the group like halfway through. I didn't see it coming. And you might can say that's because it's a penny dreadful and the writing wasn't the best and the author was looking to shake things up a bit. But frankly, to me, it was fantastic writing because it was a shock and meant I was so invested in the story that I had cared about this character on his own before this happened. So I really did feel betrayed along with the rest of the characters. This is brilliant. I really don't know why people aren't talking about Varney more. I think Varney is talked about as a character in and of himself in terms of vampire canon and how vampires have developed across fiction, specifically in the 19th century. But to me, the story that he's in, this Penny Dreadful, we should be talking about this more because to me, it was just absolutely fantastic. Now, this is one I do kind of struggle to tell you to get something that's almost 2,000 pages long. To me, it could have gone on another 1,000 pages. I'm serious. This was one of my favorite books of last year. It is truly actually one of my favorite books that I've ever read. Along with The Count of Monte Cristo, it's probably in my top 5 favorite classic novels because this just really blew me away. But if you were like me and you like something that's maybe more for entertainment than for literary value, I think you should check out Varney. But I think Varney had a lot to say. It just was in subtext. And I personally just really appreciated that. This is one of my all-time faves, and it is certainly worth the page count. But I think maybe if you wanted to get an abridged version of this, which would still be long, I would say do that because there are things that seem kind of extraneous throughout Varney the Vampire, but oh my gosh, what a ride it is. Another big classic that I think we just have to talk about is Don Quixote. So this is rather famously called kind of the first novel. And I think it's really, really interesting because the format does feel strange. To call this a novel in some ways feels strange, I think, to the modern reader. But I listened to this on audiobook last year and I was obsessed. I cannot tell y'all how much fun I had with this. And I think a lot of it had to do with the audiobook format. And so that's kind of a piece of advice I would give you. If the length of these really does bother you, I think a good audiobook will help you out. I am just not very much of an audiobook reader, so I'm really shocked that I took to this the way that I did, especially in the audio format. But it meant to me that a lot of the jokes that were in it played very well, and I found myself laughing out loud listening to this. Don Quixote is a pretty famous story, and I think what's interesting about this is just how much it has gone on to influence pop culture. And so I think most people go into Don Quixote with some knowledge of what the book is about. But I think I went in just a tad bit blind. I knew basics, I knew characters' names, I knew tilting at windmills, but I didn't know kind of the overall vibe and message of the story. And I think that aided me quite a bit. And I think it meant that I enjoyed it a whole lot more. I think there's something really beautiful about the story of Don Quixote, which is just kind of like the world can be wrong, but you can still be right. But that means there's also kind of a melancholy tone to this because it feels like Don Quixote as a character is really striving for something that's never going to come about, that he's never going to get respect for. And I think in many ways that feels sad, but to me it felt hopeful. And I think actually of the classics that I'm going to recommend today, this is the happiest of them. To me, this is the one that uplifted me the most. This is one that has intimidated me for a very, very long time. And I am so glad that I picked it up last year because I did really enjoy it. Not an all-time favorite for me, because I'll say to me at a certain point, this one did feel long. And it really did feel not like a slog, but just like I was kind of ready to be done with it. Whereas with things like The Count of Monte Cristo or Varney the Vampire, I could have meandered along with them for much longer. But this one I do think is less intimidating than what you believe. So if you, like me, have let this one linger on your shelves for years, I really do think it's worth taking a chance on, and I can see why this has remained a popular favorite across the centuries, why it still will rate as some people's favorite book today. So I'm really glad that I picked this up, and I found it to be a very rewarding reading experience. Here is another one that is maybe not that long in terms of page count, but just feels long while you're reading it, and that's Italian Hours by Henry James. I know I said no nonfiction. Technically, that's what this is. But I think in general, any Henry James can go here because there's just a way to his writing that feels very tedious to me, and it feels like I spend a long time reading anything that he wrote. But this is the only book of Henry James's that I have given 5 stars, and this is a series of essays that he wrote on Italy across many years when he traveled through Italy many different times across the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And so across that time period, he is observing tourism on the rise in Italy after the Risorgimento. And I think this is genuinely fascinating for its historical context, but it is also some of the most dreamy writing that you will ever have the privilege to read. I love anything that is written about Italy, truly I do. Y'all know that I am very basic. Say that it is set in Italy and I'll pick it up and I'll probably love it. But this is one where I felt kind of seen by Henry James. I feel like he focused on a lot of things that I like to focus on, and I found that this was just very dreamily written. But it is a book that took me so long to read, and I think that's an interesting conversation to have, is page length versus the author's writing style, because I often think an author's writing style can make a book feel not like a slog to me, but like it's taking a really long time to get through. And that is certainly the case here, but I think this is so worth your time. This feels pretty forgotten about in terms of Henry James's overall oeuvre, but I really don't know why. This is some of his best writing, in my opinion, and I think it's because he is clearly discussing things that are very personally exciting to him, things that he is really personally interested in. And something that I will always appreciate is an author's passion, basically anyone's passion on anything. And so I felt like this was really a book that you could have a conversation with, and also one that just kind of lives with you for a little while, sticks with you in the back of your mind. There are turns of phrases that he uses that are genuinely haunting to me. And so this is one of my favorite works that I've ever read about Italy, and I think it's because it examined it with an outsider's view. but an outsider who desperately wants to be an insider. And so I found that relatable personally, but I just thought it was so hauntingly beautiful, the things that he observed and the way that he wrote about them. Let's talk about my most controversial book on this list. This is a book that people will fight me on. I know. And it's another one that I would say is actually not that long in terms of page length. You'll be shocked when you pick it up. That's Moby Dick. I know everyone hates this. I have a review of this that I did a few years ago when I read this for the first time, and it just absolutely stunned me. And I often get people saying, I respect your review, but gosh, I hated this book. And I just think it's so funny, kind of the visceral reaction that people have to Moby Dick, whether that's negative or positive. For me, it was instantly positive. Page 1, I knew this was going to get 5 stars out of me. I read this at the beach, which I know sounds crazy. What was I doing reading this at the beach? This is not light reading, but I think it's because when you're on vacation, your mind is a little bit relaxed and you're ready for heavier topics. And truly, there is nothing better than reading this book while looking at the ocean. I am all about the ocean. I love books set at sea. I love books about the ocean. I love books about sea creatures. That's essentially what Moby Dick is. What I will tell you about Moby Dick that I think will help you if you have ever wanted to read it, I think it is good to go into it with the knowledge that the story of Moby Dick and Ahab is secondary to what Herman Melville wants to tell you about whales. This book is basically an ode on whaling as a way of life, but also on whales as a creature of this earth that deserves a lot of respect from us. I have never read a book this beautiful before or since. This is truly one of the most beautifully written books I have ever read, if not the most beautiful, and it's easily the best American novel that I've ever read. I can see why people hate this. I really can, because the book is not what it's set up to be. I think you think this is going to be very plot heavy, and it's going to be about a whale taking out a ship and kind of Captain Ahab's revenge story about this whale. And that's there. And the characterization is there in such an interesting way. But really, this book is about whales, and it's about the sea, and it's about a dying way of life. And I personally think that's beautiful. I mean, really, this haunted me. I thought this was profound. This really stuck with me, and it's a book that I frequently think about. It's rare for me that I get an emotional attachment to a classic the way that I have some of the ones that I've listed today. A lot of times I'm reading classics and I can go, well, this is technically proficient, and I'm often reading it for the writing, for the prose style. It's not often that it hits me on all accounts, character, plot, writing. This one did. This is one of those special books. It's truly one of my favorites of all time. And I can see why people don't like Moby Dick. I really can. But if you love the ocean, I think you need to read it. I really think you do. And I think if people go into this with the right expectation, with the knowledge of what it actually is and what it's trying to do as a novel, I think you're set up to enjoy it more than if you just assume this is a book that's about whaling. Because it is about whaling, definitely. But it's about how horrific whaling was. And so there are scenes that are really hard to read. It just sticks with me to this day, the way he described the whales in human terms and would call them gentlemen or this man. And then the men on the boat he described as animals. And it just was insane to me. You might say that's blatant, that's obvious symbolism, Jenny, but my gosh, it was done to perfection here. There is nothing wrong with this book. Again, this is not one that I can think of anything I would improve on. Truly a spectacular read, and it really is worth your time. That is just a few of the classics that I could have recommended here, but I've been talking for half an hour, so I felt like I needed to cut it short. But I would love to know down below if you have read any of these, what your favorite long classic is, and also if you have any particular recommendations, video ideas. Is there anything you want recommendations for? But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.